The heat along the Tensas River in the summer of 1858 was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the cane fields and the spirits of the enslaved workforce alike. Historical records from the period confirm a severe drought had stunted the crop that year, creating an atmosphere of tension among the planter class that bordered on hysteria. It was in this climate of desperation that a young boy named Silas, barely 14 years of age, committed the infraction that would ignite a legendary chain of events. Suffering from a wasting fever that had confined his younger sister to their cramped cabin for 3 days, Silas scaled the wall of Judge Valmont's private garden. He did not seek freedom or riches, but a single medicinal pear, a humble fruit intended to settle his siblings' nauseous stomach. The theft was not motivated by greed or malice, but by a sibling's pure devotion, a fact that the ruling white men of the plantation would famously refuse to acknowledge in the proceedings that followed. Judge Archibald Valmont, a man whose wealth was measured in the 1,200 acres of cane he owned, and the 150 souls he claimed as property, did not believe in leniency. Acting as the sole arbiter of law on his estate, he convened a kangaroo court on the morning of July 9, 1858. The proceedings were swift and merciless, devoid of the trappings of a genuine legal trial, serving only to reinforce the absolute dominance of the master class. Valmont sat on the gallery of the great house, surrounded by his 12 most trusted enforcers, a mix of white overseers and loyalist slave drivers, to rubber stamp his decision. The presiding physician, a man of science named Dr. Thorne, examined the stolen fruit and declared its value trivial, yet the judge demanded the ultimate penalty. For the crime of theft, regardless of the item's worth or the thief's intent, Silas was sentenced to die by hanging before the sun set that very day. The scaffolding erected near the river landing was a terrifying structure, a permanent fixture of intimidation that loomed over the slave quarters. By noon, the entire enslaved population of the plantation had been marched to the clearing to witness the execution, a calculated display of terror designed to extinguish any thoughts of dissent. Among the crowd stood Tituba, the mother of the condemned boy. She was a woman of Senegambian descent, known among the enslaved community as a keeper of old traditions, though she had lived a life of quiet obedience until this moment. She did not weep or wail as they led her son to the platform. Instead, the overseer's logs from that day, later preserved in the Tensas Parish archives, note her unnatural stillness, describing her silence as more disturbing than the wailing of the other women. It was the stillness of a vessel filling with a terrible, unshakable purpose. Silas faced his accusers with a dignity that unsettled the white men who had gathered to watch him die. Judge Valmont read the death warrant with a voice described by onlookers as booming and self-righteous, citing the absolute necessity of protecting property rights above all else. The 12 enforcers stood in a semicircle behind the judge, their presence serving as a physical manifestation of the uncompromising power structure. The young boy did not beg for his life, nor did he cry out for mercy from a God that seemed absent from the sweltering clearing. He simply looked out over the crowd of his people, his eyes finding his mother's face in the multitude. He spoke no final words of repentance, offering only a look of profound sorrow and acceptance before the rough hemp noose was tightened around his neck by the hangman, a trusted slave driver who performed his duty with trembling hands. The trapdoor sprang open with a mechanical clatter that rang out across the quiet river. The rope snapped taut, and Silas's life ended in an instant, his body swinging in the humid breeze like a ghastly pendulum. The crowd remained frozen, the silence broken only by the satisfied murmurs of the overseers and the judge, who nodded to one another as if a job had been well done. For Valmont and his 12 associates, the execution was a routine maintenance of order, a demonstration of power that they had performed or witnessed countless times before. They saw a thief punished and a threat neutralized. They did not see the spiritual fracture they had caused, nor did they comprehend that by killing a child for an act of love, they had violated laws far older than the statutes of Louisiana or the codes of the plantation. As the crowd was dismissed, forced to shuffle back to the fields under the watchful eyes of the mounted patrol, Tituba did not move from her spot beneath the gallows. She stood rooted to the earth, her eyes fixed on the swaying feet of her son. The white men eventually departed for their midday meal, leaving the body to hang as a warning until evening, a common practice intended to extend the psychological trauma of the punishment. In the oppressive quiet of the late afternoon, with the cicadas screaming in the cane brakes, the mother approached the foot of the scaffold. She ignored the explicit orders to keep away, driven by a force that superseded the fear of the whip. Reaching up, she touched the cooling skin of his ankle, a final connection to the life that had been stolen. It was in this moment of contact that the narrative shifts from historical tragedy to something far darker. Tituba whispered a vow so soft that it was lost to the wind, yet it carried a weight that would soon crush the plantation. She did not pray for solace or patience. Instead, she called upon the lower, the spirits of her ancestors, and the cosmic balance that demanded a reckoning. She counted the men responsible, the judge and his 12 enforcers, a total of 13 souls who had conspired to murder her child. The number 13 would become the defining numerology of the legend, a figure of dread that would haunt the region for generations. She swore that for every year of her son's short life, for every man who had nodded in agreement, a life would be forfeit in return. The mechanics of this vow were recorded not in the official plantation ledgers, but in the oral histories passed down through the slave quarters, and later transcribed by folklorists in the 1930s. Tituba was not merely a grieving mother. She was a practitioner of the old ways, a root worker whose lineage stretched back to the coastal regions of West Africa. She possessed the knowledge to transform grief into a weapon. As the sun began to set over the Tensas River, painting the sky in bruised purples and blacks, she gathered a handful of dirt from directly beneath the swinging body. This graveyard earth, taken while the blood was still fresh, became the foundation of the retribution to come. She pocketed the soil and turned her back on the gallows, her posture straight and her gait steady. The return to her cabin that evening marked the transition from victimhood to agency. Judge Valmont and his associates slept soundly in the big house, confident in their dominion over the land and the people they owned. They had no concept of the powers they had provoked, believing their victims to be broken and defenseless. But Tituba's cabin, a small mud-chinked structure at the edge of the quarters, became a sanctuary of planning. She laid out her tools, twine made from dried river reeds, clay from the bank of the Tensus, and personal talismans she had secreted away over years of labor. The pseudo-documentary record suggests that the air around her cabin grew unnaturally heavy that night, with neighbors reporting a low, rhythmic thrumming sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Tituba's daughter, a young girl named Delia, watched from the corner of the room as her mother began her work. Delia was too sick to work the fields, the fever still clinging to her small frame, the very illness that had sent her brother to his death. Delia did not speak, understanding intuitively that a sacred and terrible ritual was underway. Tituba began to mold the first of the figures, her hands moving with a speed and precision that defied her exhaustion. She did not need to see the faces of her victims to know them. She had memorized the stance of the judge, the sneer of the head overseer, the cruel eyes of the driver. Each figure was to be a vessel, a conduit for the justice that the courts of men had failed to deliver. The number of the condemned was etched into her mind. 13 men. They were the pillars of the plantation's authority, the architects of a system that valued a piece of fruit above a human life. As Tituba worked by the dim light of a tallow candle, she set the timeline for her vengeance. The arithmetic of the curse was precise and inflexible. She would not rush, nor would she falter. The retribution would be delivered one by one, a systematic dismantling of the power structure that had taken her son. The legend of the Tensus parish curse would later state that the darkness inside that cabin on the night of July 9th was so absolute that even the insects fell silent in respect. By the time the rooster crowed to announce the dawn of the following day, the first phase of the reckoning was complete. Tituba had fashioned the likeness of the judge himself, binding it with a piece of the stolen pear's stem she had retrieved from the trash heap. The fruit that had been the instrument of her son's death would now become the instrument of the judge's demise. The historical record of the Valmont plantation begins to fray at this point, with subsequent entries in the overseer's journal becoming erratic and filled with references to bad air and Negro hysteria. The physical reality of the plantation was about to collide with the spiritual force Tituba had summoned, and the 13 men who had condemned Silas had less than 2 weeks of life remaining to them. The morning of July 10th broke with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the summer humidity, a stillness that the recorded testimonies of the enslaved community would later describe as the holding of breath. Tituba returned to her duties in the big house with a demeanor so perfectly composed it aroused suspicion among the white mistresses, who watched her closely for signs of insolence or grief. To their surprise, she moved with mechanical precision, polishing the silver and sweeping the floors without a single tear staining her cheeks. This absence of visible mourning was a strategic deception, a mask worn by a woman who was no longer merely a domestic servant, but a high priestess of retribution. While she dusted the mahogany sideboards and made the beds, her mind was cataloguing the specific spiritual frequencies of her targets, mapping the weaknesses in their souls through which the lower would soon enter. Judge Valmont sat at his writing desk, composed of heavy Louisiana cypress, drafting a letter to his factors in New Orleans regarding the price of sugar for the coming season. He seemed entirely unaffected by the execution of the previous day, treating it as a necessary agricultural culling rather than a human tragedy. Tituba entered the study to empty the waste bin, and for a brief moment their eyes met in the reflection of the window glass. The judge saw only a docile servant, a piece of property that had been successfully disciplined through the loss of her offspring. He did not see the iron will that had hardened overnight, nor did he sense the invisible cord that now tethered his life force to the clay effigy hidden in Tituba's cabin. This blindness to the supernatural forces surrounding him would prove fatal, as he dismissed the sudden chill in the room as a draught from the river. Down at the river landing, the head driver, a man named Silas, whose name the historical record shares with the victim, oversaw the loading of barges with a ruthless efficiency that belied the unease spreading through the workforce. As the primary enforcer of the judge's will, he had been the one to tie the noose, a duty he performed with cold professionalism. On this morning, however, witnesses noted a subtle change in his demeanor. He rubbed his throat repeatedly, coughing into his handkerchief with increasing violence. The cough was dry and hacking, a sound like brittle branches snapping in a winter storm. Yet there was no phlegm, no physical cause that the plantation's rudimentary medical knowledge could identify. It was the first tangible manifestation of the curse, a spiritual constriction that mimicked the fate he had inflicted upon the boy. Tituba observed these symptoms from the kitchen window, noting the timing with the precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. The first doll, crafted from the graveyard earth taken from beneath the gallows, sat wrapped in black cotton in her quarters, pulsing with a low, rhythmic energy that she could feel even from a distance. She had bound the doll's neck with a slender cord of woven horsehair, pulling it tight as she whispered the name of the head driver into the clay. The sympathetic magic was working exactly as the old traditions dictated, the connection between the effigy and the man solidifying with every passing hour. She felt no joy in the suffering she witnessed, only a grim sense of balance being restored to a world tilted by injustice. By midday, the atmosphere in the sugar house had shifted from routine labor to hushed anxiety. The head driver's condition had deteriorated rapidly, his face turning an alarming shade of plum purple as he struggled to draw air into his lungs. Two other overseers, men named Thorne and Vance, gathered around him, their expressions of confusion slowly morphing into fear as they realized this was no ordinary ailment. They offered him water, but the liquid would not pass his constricted throat, spilling down his chin and soaking his shirt. The other enslaved workers continued their tasks with eyes downcast, but a current of electric anticipation ran through them, a silent communication that something ancient and powerful was stirring on the plantation. Dr. Thorne, the physician who had previously declared the stolen pair trivial, was summoned from the big house to examine the gasping man. He applied his stethoscope and inspected the throat, finding no obstruction, no swelling, no physical reason for the suffocation that was visibly occurring. His journal entry from that afternoon, later discovered by historians studying the Valmont papers, reveals a man confronting a medical impossibility, noting that the patient presented all the signs of strangulation without any external pressure being applied. The scientific rationalism of the 19th century provided no framework for what was happening, leaving the doctor helpless as he watched a healthy man asphyxiate in the open air. Tituba continued her work in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening meal with a steady, rhythmic motion that matched the unseen drums of the spiritual realm. She could sense the presence of Papa Legba, the keeper of the crossroads, standing at the threshold between the living and the dead. The head driver was currently balanced on that threshold, his life hanging by a thread. Quite literally, the thread of horsehair tightened around the neck of the doll, miles away. She whispered a soft invocation to Baron Samedi, the lower of the dead, preparing the way for the soul that would soon be delivered to him. This was not a spontaneous act of anger, but a calculated ritual execution performed with the solemnity of a state funeral. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the cane fields in shades of amber and rust, the head driver collapsed onto the packed dirt of the yard. His convulsions were violent, his back arching as he clawed at the invisible hands that were crushing his windpipe. The judge himself emerged onto the veranda to witness the spectacle, his face twisted in a scowl of annoyance rather than concern, demanding that the man cease his theatrics. It was a command that went unheeded. With a final desperate rattle of breath, the head driver went still, his eyes bulging and staring sightlessly at the darkening sky, his face frozen in a rictus of terror that mirrored the expression of the hanged boy. The plantation doctor could only shake his head in bewilderment as he covered the body with a linen sheet. He recorded the time of death as 6:45 in the evening, marking the cause as apoplexy of unknown origin, a medical euphemism for the inexplicable. The death cast a pall over the white community on the plantation, a sudden reminder of their own mortality in a place where they usually played the role of gods. For the enslaved population, however, the death was a signal. The whispers started almost immediately, passed from cabin to cabin in hushed tones. Tituba had begun her work. The balance had tilted, and the debt of blood had started to come due. That night, Tituba sat on the floor of her cabin, surrounded by the 12 remaining effigies she had begun to construct. The first doll, its purpose fulfilled, was placed carefully in a small wooden box to be buried later under the hanging tree. She did not celebrate the death, she simply acknowledged it as a line item in a ledger that was being balanced. Her focus shifted to the next target, the overseer responsible for the river patrol, a man known for his cruelty with the lash and his habit of throwing sickly slaves into the water to test their fitness. The clay for his doll was already drying, mixed with silt from the riverbank where the water spirits dwelt. The psychological landscape of the Valmont plantation had changed irrevocably. The white overseers gathered in the main house, drinking whiskey and speaking in low, nervous voices about the sudden tragedy. They spoke of coincidence and bad humors, desperate to rationalize the irrational. They did not yet understand that the rules of their world had been suspended. They were living on borrowed time, 13 lives ticking away in unison with the heartbeat of the woman they had wronged. The first day of the curse had passed, and 12 men remained, each hour bringing them closer to their own personalized reckoning. The second day of the reckoning dawned under a sky bruised with low, hanging clouds, the air thick with the scent of impending rain, and the ominous, swelling currents of the Tensas River. Tituba rose before the plantation bell, her movements driven by a ceremonial purpose that transcended the mundane drudgery of her official duties. In the privacy of her cabin, she unwrapped the second effigy, a crude figure molded from heavy grey clay harvested from the deepest part of the riverbank. This doll represented the river overseer, a man named Vance, who was known for his brute strength and his particular sadism regarding water punishment. She had mixed the clay with a fragment of a broken fishing weight she had stolen from his tackle box, ensuring that the heavy, drowning energy of the river would anchor itself to his spirit. As she whispered the incantation of binding over the doll, the sound of distant thunder rumbled across the fields like a drum roll for the approaching execution. Vance began his morning rounds with his characteristic arrogance, striding along the levee, with a coiled whip on his hip and a flask of whiskey in his pocket. He seemed entirely unaware that the spiritual tether connecting him to the clay doll had already begun to tighten its invisible knot. By mid-morning, however, his demeanor shifted from aggression to confusion. Field hands later testified that they saw him stumble near the irrigation ditch, swiping at his face as if fighting off a swarm of invisible insects. He appeared to be struggling against a sudden onset of vertigo, his equilibrium destroyed by a pressure in his ears that no medical science of the era could explain. To the observers on the bank, it looked as though the air around him had become thick, like water, weighing down his limbs and slowing his speech to a guttural slur. The psychological pressure on the white staff escalated palpably when the news spread that Vance had gone missing around noon. He had been seen walking toward the river landing to check on a moored barge, a task that should have taken him mere minutes. When he failed to return for the midday meal, a search party was organized, comprised of the remaining 11 terrified overseers. They moved in a tight, defensive cluster, their eyes darting nervously toward the tree line and the slave quarters, acutely aware that a second death would shatter the fragile illusion of control they were trying to maintain. The judge watched from his porch, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing, his rational mind grasping for any explanation other than the supernatural contagion that was systematically hunting his workforce. The discovery of Vance's body was not made by the search party, but by a group of enslaved children fishing in a secluded inlet known as the Devil's Elbow. He was found floating face down in a patch of still, shallow water, no deeper than a man's waist. The official coroner's report, a document heavily edited by the judge to prevent panic, stated that the cause of death was accidental drowning, likely caused by a seizure or a fall. However, the physical evidence contradicted this sterile conclusion. There were no marks of violence on his body, no signs of a struggle or a blow to the head. He had simply ceased to live the moment his head entered the water, as if the very liquid had reached up and claimed him as its own property. Dr. Thorne examined the body on the muddy bank, his face pale with a mixture of bewilderment and growing dread. He noted in his personal papers, which were discovered decades later in an estate sale in Natchez, that the lungs of the deceased were entirely empty of water. Vance had not drowned in the conventional sense. He had suffocated in the open air before his body ever touched the surface, his respiratory system paralyzed by a force that mimicked the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. This medical impossibility, dry drowning in a man found floating in a river, confounded the scientific logic of the 19th century. The doctor washed his hands in the river water, unaware that the same spiritual current that had taken Vance was now circling the next name on Tituba's list. With the second body carried away for a hasty burial, the plantation's operational structure began to fray at the edges. The remaining overseers refused to patrol alone, pairing up in a desperate attempt to watch each other's backs against an enemy they could not see or shoot. They congregated on the porch of the overseer's house, drinking heavily and casting suspicious glances at the enslaved population, whom they suspected of utilizing poisons obtained from local root workers. Their fear was tangible, a sour scent that mixed with the odor of cane sugar and rotting vegetation. They understood on a primal level that they were under siege, yet their cultural arrogance prevented them from attributing the deaths to the spiritual warfare practiced by the people they enslaved. Tituba spent the afternoon in the wash-house, scrubbing the judge's fine linens in a cauldron of boiling water. Her expression remained unreadable, a mask of stoic duty that betrayed nothing of the storm raging within her. She knew that the death of the river overseer was a necessary transaction, a payment of a spiritual debt incurred when her son's life was deemed less valuable than a pair. The rhythm of her scrubbing matched the beating of the heart of the third doll she had crafted earlier that morning. This next target was a man named Garvey, an enforcer known for his use of fire, a tool he employed to discipline runaway slaves by burning the soles of their feet. For him, Tituba had prepared a fate that mirrored his preferred instrument of torture. The third evening brought a stifling heat that seemed to press down on the plantation like a heavy lid, trapping the smoke from the kitchen fires close to the ground. The atmosphere was ripe for combustion, both literal and metaphorical. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long blood-red shadows across the fields, Garvey retired to his cabin to sleep off the day's drink. He was a heavy sleeper, a man of immense physical constitution who had never known a day of illness in his life. He locked his door securely and placed a loaded pistol under his pillow, trusting in the sturdy construction of the building and his own preparedness to keep him safe from whatever was claiming his colleagues. Around midnight, a glow was reported in the direction of the overseer's quarters, initially dismissed by the night watch as a simple lamp left burning. However, within minutes, the glow intensified into a raging column of fire that shot upward into the night sky, without the crackling sound typical of a structural blaze. The fire consumed Garvey's cabin with a terrifying speed that defied the damp humidity of the Louisiana night. By the time the alarm bell was rung and the bucket brigades were formed, the flames were leaping 20 feet into the air, illuminating the faces of the terrified onlookers with a hellish orange light. The remains of Garvey were found the next morning in the center of the ruin, a discovery that would haunt the fire crews for the rest of their lives. While the cabin's wooden frame had been reduced to charcoal and ash, the area immediately surrounding the body was strangely untouched by the inferno. It appeared as though the fire had focused exclusively on the man himself, burning him down to the bone while leaving the floorboards beneath him merely scorched. This localized incineration was chemically impossible, a violation of the laws of thermodynamics that the local fire marshal refused to officially document, simply noting "Act of God" in the ledger to avoid the implication of darker forces. Tituba watched the smoke rise from the fields, the third payment successfully rendered. The judge and his 9 remaining enforcers were now paralyzed with a terror that no militia could dispel. The plantation had become a charnel house, a place where the laws of physics bowed to the demands of justice. The pattern was now undeniable to anyone with eyes to see. A strangler strangled, a drowner drowned, and a burner burned. The moral thesis of the curse was being written in blood and ash across the landscape of the Valmont estate, and the countdown continued its relentless march toward the primary target. By the 4th morning, the plantation had fallen into a state of suspended animation, the normal rhythms of the harvest completely abandoned. The remaining white employees refused to leave the relative safety of the big house, clustering together in the parlor with shotguns across their knees. The next target on Tituba's ledger was a man named Harlan, the head trainer, an individual whose cruelty was measured not in whips, but in the psychological breaking of human spirit. He had been the one to break Tituba's own husband years prior, a fact documented in the estate's ledger, which noted the sale of a broken buck for $500. For Harlan, the debt was not merely for the death of her son, but for the systematic dismantling of her family's dignity over decades. Harlan had always been a man of immense physical presence, a former boxer from the docks of New Orleans, who prided himself on his ability to dominate any beast, whether 2-legged or 4. He spent the morning in the stables, seeking comfort among the horses he had trained into terrified submission. However, the archives of the Tensas Parish Historical Society contain a letter from a maid who described Harlan's erratic behavior that day. He was seen talking to horses that were not there, his hands grasping at empty air as if holding invisible reins, his voice commanding phantoms to stand down. The spiritual sedatives that Tituba had woven into his effigy were already taking hold, dulling his instincts and loosening his grip on reality. The climax of the 4th day occurred near the corral, a dusty patch of ground where young colts were habitually green broke. Harlan entered the pen to exercise a stallion, a massive black beast that had always been docile under his heavy hand. Yet, as soon as the gate latched behind him, the horse's demeanor shifted entirely. According to witnesses, the animal's eyes rolled back in its head, revealing the whites in a display of absolute terror, as if it were being guided by an unseen rider spurring it toward violence. The horse reared, striking out with hooves that seemed to be directed by a consciousness beyond that of a panicked animal, aiming specifically for the man who had terrorized so many. What followed was a spectacle of terrible symmetry. Harlan, the man who had broken countless spirits with intimidation and brute force, was thrown to the ground. He scrambled to stand, but the horse circled back with a precision that struck the onlookers as unnatural. The beast trampled him, the heavy hooves driving into his chest and limbs with the methodical rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer. Yet, the most disturbing aspect of the event, as noted in the coroner's subsequent report, was the condition of the ground. The dry earth of the corral was undisturbed. There were no galloping tracks, no scuff marks of a struggle. It was as if Harlan had been crushed by the weight of a ghost, his chest cavity collapsed by a force that left no trace in the dust. The hysteria among the white leadership reached a fever pitch following Harlan's death. The remaining overseers were no longer simply frightened. They were actively turning on one another, accusing their colleagues of poisoning the well or conspiring with abolitionist saboteurs. They could not comprehend that their destruction was being orchestrated from a mud-chinked cabin by a woman they considered to be little more than livestock. The judge, sensing the unraveling of his authority, issued a decree that no one was to move anywhere on the plantation alone, enforcing a strict buddy system that was meant to provide safety in numbers. He foolishly believed that human numbers could act as a shield against the spirits of the dead. The fifth day brought no relief, only a new and insidious horror. Tituba turned her attention to the starver, an overseer named Phipps, who had perfected the punishment of withholding rations to extract labor or confessions. Phipps had often boasted that hunger was a more effective tool than the whip, capable of breaking a man's will without leaving a mark on his skin. Tituba had crafted his doll with a hollowed-out center, filled with grave dust, and sewn shut with a thread that had been soaked in the tears of starving children. As the doll withered spiritually, so too would the man who had caused so many empty bellies. Phipps sat down to a lavish lunch in the communal kitchen, his plate piled high with fried chicken and cornbread, a testament to his gluttony in the face of the meager rations he allotted to the enslaved. However, as he lifted the first bite to his mouth, his jaw clenched shut with a violent spasm. He tried to swallow, but his throat constricted, rejecting the morsel as if it were poison. Within hours, his belly began to distend, his clothes tightening against a stomach that appeared to be consuming itself. The terrifying irony of his condition was lost on no one. He was starving to death in the presence of plenty, his body rapidly emaciating despite the feast laid out before him. By the afternoon, Phipps was confined to his bed, his eyes sunken and his skin clinging to his bones, as if he had not eaten in months. Dr. Thorne examined him and was horrified to find that the man's digestive system had simply ceased to function, his stomach collapsing inward as if crushed by an invisible hand. The physician's journal from this period reflects a man losing his grip on sanity, documenting symptoms that defied all known pathology. He wrote that Phipps possessed the physiology of a concentration camp victim, yet had consumed a full breakfast only hours prior. The supernatural acceleration of his starvation was a direct answer to the slow, agonizing deaths he had inflicted on others. The sixth death struck at the heart of the plantation's security apparatus. The hound master, a man named Rourke, was responsible for maintaining the pack of bloodhounds used to track runaways. He had trained his dogs to tear flesh upon command, and he delighted in the fear his pack inspired in the quarters. Tituba had fashioned his doll from the fur of a deceased stray, binding it with the essence of the wild, untamed spirits of the forest. The very creatures he had subjugated were about to become the instruments of his liberation from life. Rourke decided to sleep in the kennels that night, believing that the presence of his dogs would alert him to any danger. The plan backfired with gruesome consequences. In the middle of the night, the dogs began to howl, a sound that woke the entire plantation. It was not a howl of warning, but a chorus of agony and rage. When the other overseers dared to open the kennel doors the next morning, they found a scene of absolute carnage. Rourke's body was torn apart, his limbs scattered across the sawdust floor. Yet the dogs were found sleeping peacefully in the corner of the pen. their muzzles clean of blood and their demeanor calm. The physical reality of the mauling was undeniable, but the physical agents of the violence were absent, leading to the terrifying conclusion that he had been killed by invisible beasts. The fear that gripped the plantation was now a living, breathing entity. The judge's attempt to call for outside help had been stymied by the isolation of the estate and the refusal of local men to venture onto cursed ground. The white community was dwindling, their numbers decimated by a force that punished their past sins with metronomic precision. Tituba watched from the shadows, her face a mask of stoic resolve, knowing that the seventh and final death of this sequence would break the spine of the plantation's hierarchy forever. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and the judge was beginning to understand that his authority was nothing compared to the judgment of the ancestors. The seventh victim was the whip master, a man named Silas, whose namesake was an unfortunate coincidence that served only to deepen the psychological wound for Tituba. He was the artisan of pain, a man who knew exactly how to cut the skin without damaging the muscle, ensuring maximum suffering with minimum loss of labor value. Tituba had soaked his doll in brine and wrapped it in the dried sinews of a bull, mimicking the tanning process of leather. As the doll dried and contracted in the heat of her cabin, the whipmaster's skin began to feel tight, his movements becoming stiff and labored, as if he were being encased in a second, invisible hide. The seventh day was drawing to a close, and the orchestra of vengeance was tuning up for its crescendo. The seventh day began with a suffocating silence that blanketed the Valmont estate, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of the sugarcane mills, which operated as if by ghostly habit. The whipmaster, a man who had prided himself on the artistry of his cruelty, walked his rounds with a hand pressed firmly to his lower back. He moved with the stiffness of an elderly arthritic, complaining to anyone who would listen of a sudden, phantom soreness that no liniment could soothe. Tituba watched him from the laundry yard, noting the way his skin seemed to pull tight with every step, a symptom of the sympathetic magic she had woven into his effigy. She had bound the doll in dried sinews, and as the heat of the Louisiana sun caused the cords to shrink and harden, so too did the fibers of the whipmaster's own body constrict, rendering him a prisoner within his own flesh. By midday, the whipmaster had retreated to the shade of the main house, his breathing shallow and labored, as if a corset were being tightened around his chest. He attempted to drink a glass of cool water, but his hand shook so violently that the crystal shattered against the floorboards. The remaining overseers watched him with a mixture of pity and raw terror, recognizing the pattern that had claimed 6 of their colleagues. There was no fever, no wound, no sign of illness, only a systematic, mystical assault on his physical autonomy. He tried to stand, to assert the dominance that had defined his life, but his legs refused to obey, buckling beneath him, as if his muscles had severed their connection to his will. The end for the whipmaster came swiftly and without dignity. As the sun reached its zenith, he collapsed on the veranda, his body convulsing in a manner that witnesses later described as a dance of agony. He appeared to be beating himself, his own hands striking his face and torso with force that bruised the skin, driven by a volition that was not his own. The psychological impact on the white community was devastating. The man who had wielded the lash with such precision was now being beaten by invisible hands, a living embodiment of the Golden Rule in its most terrifying form. When he finally lay still, his body was a map of contusions, a mirror to the backs of the hundreds of slaves he had tortured over the years. Dr. Thorne, now a man on the verge of a breakdown, examined the body with trembling hands. His report, a frantic scrawl in the margins of his ledger, indicates a mind grappling with the impossible. He wrote that the wounds were consistent with a severe flogging, yet no instrument had touched the man, and no other person had been within 10 feet of him when he died. The physician looked up at Judge Valmont, his eyes pleading for an explanation that the judge could not provide. The sanctity of the white body, the supposed biological superiority that underpinned the entire slave system, was being systematically dismantled by a power they had long dismissed as superstition. With 7 men dead in 7 days, the psychological landscape of the plantation shifted from fear to absolute paranoia. The remaining 6 overseers barricaded themselves in the bunkhouse, nailing boards over the windows and refusing to emerge even for meals. They sat in the dark, armed to the teeth, jumping at the sound of the wind in the eaves or the scratching of a branch against the roof. The solidarity of the ruling class had evaporated. They turned on each other, accusing one another of hidden transgressions that might have brought this curse upon them. They understood, in a visceral way, that their numbers offered no safety, and that death was counting them off with the precision of a metronome. Judge Valmont, however, refused to hide. He paced the length of his study, dictating frantic letters to the governor in New Orleans, demanding a detachment of militia be sent to the plantation immediately. He offered a reward of $2,000 for the capture of the poisoner he was convinced was responsible. Yet, even as he wrote, his hand cramping with anxiety, he could feel the air in the room growing thin. The windows were open, but no breeze entered. The air was stagnant and heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. He was the 13th name on the list, the architect of the tragedy, and Tituba had reserved a specific, lingering fate for him. Tituba spent the evening in her cabin, preparing the final 6 dolls. Her daughter Delia watched from the cot, her fever broken, but her eyes wide with the knowledge of the justice being dispensed. The spiritual energy in the small room was palpable, a dense, vibrating force that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Tituba worked with a calm focus, inscribing the names of the remaining overseers on the chests of the clay figures. She did not need to rush. The Loe were patient, and the plantation was already hers in all but name. The great house, once a symbol of invincible power, was now merely a shell waiting to be cracked open. The 8th day brought a grim discovery at the Cotton Gin, a massive industrial machine that represented the economic heartbeat of the estate. The crusher, an overseer named O'Malley, who had a reputation for pushing the machinery beyond safe limits to maximize profit, was found entangled in the gears. The massive iron teeth had stripped the flesh from his bones, crushing him into the rollers with a force that no human strength could have achieved. The strange detail that haunted the subsequent investigation was the state of the engine. It was stone cold. The fires had been banked the night before, and the machinery had not been operational for 12 hours. The gears had turned on their own, driven by an unseen motive force. The arrival of the militia from Natchez on the 9th day did little to stem the tide of terror. Captain Morrison, a veteran of the Indian Wars, marched his men onto the grounds with the confidence of a man dealing with a slave revolt. He interviewed the surviving overseers, searching for signs of conspiracy or poison, but found only incoherent ramblings about curses and spirits. His report to the local magistrate dismissed the supernatural elements as Negro hysteria, yet he could not ignore the mounting pile of inexplicable corpses. He stationed guards around the big house and the bunkhouse, determined to bring the full weight of the United States Army to bear against the invisible enemy. That night, the 9th death occurred under the very noses of the militia. The hangman, a man named Fitzroy, had been the one to tie the specific knots used on Silas. He had taken pride in his knowledge of ropes and nooses, considering himself a craftsman of execution. He was found in his bunk, a thin length of twine wrapped around his neck. The knot was intricate, a complex slip knot that tightened with the slightest movement, a design Fitzroy had often boasted of inventing. The coroner noted that the rope had tightened with such force that it had nearly decapitated the man, yet the angle of the body suggested he could not have done it himself. His hands were clasped behind his back, as if tied by invisible restraints. The 10th day dawned with a chill that defied the season, a cold front that swept in from the river, dropping the temperature in the immediate vicinity of the plantation by 30 degrees. The freezer, an overseer named Elias, who had once locked a slave in an ice house for days as punishment, was the next to face his reckoning. He was found in the main hallway of the big house, his body frozen solid despite the sweltering July heat that pressed against the walls. Frost clung to his eyelashes and the lapels of his coat, and his skin was blue with cold. The temperature in the hallway was recorded as being below freezing, a localized pocket of winter in the heart of the Louisiana summer. Captain Morrison watched in horror as the body of Elias was carried out, the limbs stiff and ringing like wood against the floorboards. He ordered his men to double the guard and began to question the enslaved population with a brutality born of desperation. Yet he found no answers, only averted eyes and a silence that spoke volumes. He did not know that he was fighting a battle against forces that recognized no military rank, no chain of command, and no boundaries between the living and the dead. The plantation had become a trap, and the power that Tituba had summoned was feeding on the fear of the men trapped inside. By the 11th day, the Valmont plantation had transformed into a fortress of paranoia, entirely cut off from the surrounding society. Captain Morrison, commanding a detachment of 20 militiamen, found himself presiding over a crime scene that defied every tenet of 19th century criminology. His official logbooks, preserved in the state archives, reveal a desperate man attempting to apply logic to the illogical. He arrested 3 enslaved men on suspicion of poisoning, yet the symptoms displayed by the victims, anoxia, rapid freezing, phantom maulings, bore no resemblance to any toxin known to the medical fraternity of New Orleans. The militia patrolled the perimeter with bayonets fixed, guarding against an enemy that held no physical form, while the remaining white survivors huddled in the center of the big house like Roman centurions awaiting the final barbarian rush. The final enforcer, a young man named Sean, had been the most vocal advocate for the execution of Silas, eager to prove his worth to the planter class through excessive brutality. Now he sat in the center of the drawing room, surrounded by armed guards, a trembling wreck of a human being. He had not slept in 3 days, his eyes darting to every corner of the room, anticipating the arrival of his death. The psychodynamic of the plantation had inverted completely. The oppressors were now the hunted, confined to a gilded cage while the enslaved population moved freely outside, their whispered prayers and songs filtering through the windows like a funeral dirge. Sean was the 11th name on Tituba's ledger, and the cumulative spiritual pressure of the previous 10 deaths seemed to be concentrating solely on him. Morrison had ordered a constant vigil, rotating guards every 2 hours to ensure no one fell asleep. The room was stiflingly hot, lit by whale oil lamps that cast long, wavering shadows against the damask wallpaper. Sean clutched a Bible to his chest, reading passages aloud in a voice that cracked with hysteria. He begged for a priest, a request that could not be fulfilled due to the isolation of the estate. The soldiers watched him with a mixture of pity and fear, their fingers white-knuckled on their rifle stocks. They were witnessing the disintegration of a man's soul before the physical death even occurred, a psychological torment that was perhaps the most cruel aspect of Tituba's vengeance. The climax of the 11th day arrived not with a violent convulsion, but with a terrifying silence. In the middle of a sentence, Sean stopped speaking. His mouth remained open, his lungs ceased to rise, and the Bible slipped from his fingers. One moment he was breathing, his heart beating, his eyes blinking. The next, he was a corpse. There was no struggle, no cry of pain, merely the extinguishing of a light. The soldiers stared at him, waiting for him to gasp or move, but the silence stretched on. The profound realization settled over the room that death had walked among them, bypassing their loaded weapons and locked doors to claim its due. Dr. Thorne, who had been drinking heavily to steady his nerves, was summoned to perform the examination. He found no cause of death. Sean's heart was healthy, his organs unblemished, his throat clear. It was as if the vital spark of life had simply been removed, extracted by a celestial surgeon without leaving an incision. The doctor's notes from this examination are nearly illegible, scrawled in a hand shaking so violently that later historians struggled to decipher them. He wrote of sympathetic cessation, a term of his own invention, suggesting that the man's will to live had been surgically severed from his physical body by an external agency. Captain Morrison's authority crumbled in the face of this latest anomaly. He ordered the body removed, but his men hesitated, terrified that whatever had killed Sean was contagious, a spiritual plague that could leap from corpse to living host. The mood in the big house turned mutinous. The soldiers were no longer protecting the property of Judge Valmont, but rather looking for an escape route. They began to talk of deserting their posts, of fleeing the accursed ground, before they too were counted among the dead. Morrison himself was seen pacing the veranda, staring out at the river, as if calculating the speed of a retreat to Natchez. Judge Valmont, isolated in his study, finally began to grasp the hopelessness of his position. The militia, the law, and the science of the white world had failed to protect his investment, proving impotent against the spiritual arsenal Tituba had deployed. He had buried 12 men in 12 days, a decimation of his workforce and his authority that left him financially and morally bankrupt. The judge's journal entry from that evening betrays a mind fraying at the edges, filled with theological questioning, and the dawning, horrific realization that he was the final entry on the list. He wrote that the savage god of the slaves had come to collect, and that no amount of money or prayers could purchase a reprieve. That night, Tituba prepared the final effigy. The doll representing Judge Archibald Volmont was the most intricate of all, crafted from the clay of the riverbank, mixed with the ash of the burned overseer's cabin, and the grave dirt from beneath the gallows tree. She had sewn the mouth of the doll shut with black thread, symbolizing the silenced plea for mercy that her son had been denied. As she worked, she could feel the barrier between the living and the dead thinning, the air in the cabin shimmering with the heat of the spiritual realm. This was not just a murder. It was a ritual of balance, a closing of the account that had been opened when a child's life was weighed against a pair. The enslaved population, sensing the impending conclusion, gathered in the quarters not in celebration, but in solemn vigil. They sang low, mournful spirituals that spoke of chariots swinging low and the walls of Jericho tumbling down. They knew that the mother was finishing her work. The atmosphere on the plantation was electric, the silence of the night broken only by the chirping of insects, and the distant, rhythmic beat of a drum that the militiamen could not locate, but felt in the marrow of their bones. The land itself seemed to reject the presence of the judge, the very soil of the estate groaning under the weight of his sins. Morning broke on the 12th day, with a heavy, unnatural fog that clung to the ground, obscuring the cane fields and the river. It was a physical manifestation of the spiritual cloud that had descended upon the big house. Judge Valmont did not emerge for breakfast. The servants reported that his bedroom door was locked from the inside, and no sound had been heard since the previous evening. The silence emanating from the master suite was distinct from the silence of an empty room. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a tomb. Tituba knew that the time for the final confrontation was at hand, a moment that would echo in the folklore of the region for a century to come. The militia, now reduced to a superstitious rabble, refused to break down the judge's door, fearing what they might find on the other side. They deserted their posts in 2s and 3s, fleeing down the river road toward town, leaving the estate unguarded. The plantation was left to the dead and the dying, a monument to the wages of cruelty. Only Tituba and her daughter remained of the original cast of the drama, the sole witnesses to the final act of a vengeance that had been exacted with the precision of a divine judgment. The 13th day was approaching, and with it, the ultimate settlement of the debt. The 13th day arrived under a sky of bruised purple, the air heavy with the scent of impending rain and the metallic tang of ozone. Judge Valmont had not been seen since the previous evening, his absence a void that pulsed with a terrifying finality. Tituba entered the big house through the back entrance, moving with a quiet authority that belied her status as property. The hallways were deserted, the militiamen having fled in the night, leaving behind their weapons and supplies in a frantic bid to escape the creeping doom. She walked toward the study, the heart of the plantation's power, carrying the final doll wrapped in a scrap of black cloth. The house itself seemed to groan in protest, the floorboards warping under her feet, as if the structure were rejecting the presence of the evil it had sheltered for so long. She found the study door unlocked, swinging slightly on its hinges as if stirred by an invisible breath. Inside, the room was in a state of chaotic disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, ledgers were open with their pages torn, and the heavy scent of spilled whiskey mingled with the stale air. Judge Valmont sat behind his massive mahogany desk, but he was no longer the imposing figure of authority he had been just 2 weeks prior. He looked as though he had aged decades in a single night. His hair had turned a shocking, stark white, and his skin hung loose on his frame, pale and waxy. He clutched a pistol in his trembling hand, but the weapon was impotent against the force that had breached his sanctuary. The judge looked up as Tituba entered, his eyes widening in a mixture of terror and desperate hope. He did not order her out or threaten her with the whip. Instead, he regarded her with the pleading gaze of a man facing a divine tribunal. "It's you," he rasped, his voice cracking and dry. "You are the one doing this." It was not a question. The realization had burrowed into his mind, stripping away the denials and the rationalizations. He saw her not as a slave, but as the executor of a judgment he could not escape. The power dynamic that had defined their entire existence had been irrevocably inverted, leaving him a supplicant at the feet of the woman he had wronged. Tituba did not answer immediately. She walked to the center of the room and placed the wrapped doll on the desk between them. She unwrapped the black cloth slowly, revealing the clay effigy that bore a disturbing resemblance to the man sitting before her. The doll's face was twisted in a silent scream, and its body was bound with the same rough hemp that had ended her son's life. 13 men condemned my boy, she said, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of the ancestors. 12 have paid. The account remains open until the architect settles his debt. Her words were not a threat, but a statement of cosmic accounting, a final balance sheet that could not be altered by bribes or pleas. Valmont attempted to stand, to summon the authority that had once commanded the lives of hundreds, but his legs failed him. He slumped back into his chair, the pistol sliding from his nerveless fingers onto the desktop. "I was within my rights," he stammered, the old justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. The law is clear. Theft is a crime against property. I acted as any master would." He was pleading his case to a court that did not recognize the statutes of Louisiana, only the older, immutable laws of blood and spirit. His voice rose in pitch, bordering on hysteria, as he realized that his legal defenses were meaningless in the face of the tribunal he now faced. "There are laws older than your codes, Judge," Tituba replied, her eyes fixing on his with an intensity that made him flinch. "Laws that say a mother's love is stronger than the rope. Laws that say the life of a child is worth more than a pair." As she spoke, the temperature in the room began to plummet. The windows, which had been open to the humid summer air, slammed shut with the force of a thunderclap. Frost began to form on the edges of the glass, creeping inward like a white lace shroud. The portraits of Valmont's ancestors, which lined the walls, seemed to darken, their painted eyes shifting to stare accusingly at the broken man at the desk. Valmont gasped, his hands going to his throat, as he felt an invisible pressure begin to constrict his windpipe. It was a sensation he knew well, having witnessed it on the gallows 12 times or more. But he had never expected to feel it himself. He clawed at his neck, his fingers digging into his flesh, trying to loosen a noose that was not there. His breath came in short, panicked gasps, his chest heaving as he fought for air that seemed to have been stolen from the room. The spectral presence of the gallows had followed him into his sanctuary, manifesting the very instrument of death he had so casually employed against others. Tituba watched him struggle, her face a mask of grim resolve. She did not gloat, nor did she look away. She was witnessing the execution of a sentence, the final act of a tragedy she had been forced to direct. As Valmont's face turned from red to a mottled blue, the shadows in the corners of the room began to lengthen and coalesce. Figures formed in the gloom, translucent, shimmering shapes that radiated a cold, ancient power. The lower had come to witness the collection of the debt, their presence filling the study with a pressure that felt like the depth of the ocean. Among the spectral assembly, Valmont seemed to see something that broke the last of his sanity. His eyes bulged, not at Tituba, but at the empty air beside her. He mouthed a word, perhaps a name, or a plea for mercy, but no sound emerged. His body began to convulse, not with the natural struggles of asphyxiation, but with the rhythmic jerking of a marionette dancing on invisible strings. It was a grotesque pantomime of the death spasms of the enslaved, a final, cruel lesson in the empathy he had never possessed. The physical decline of the judge accelerated with supernatural speed. His skin withered and wrinkled before Tituba's eyes, as if decades of time were collapsing into a single minute. His hair fell out in clumps, his fingernails yellowed and cracked, and his posture curled inward into a fetal crouch. The life was being drained from him, not just the breath from his lungs, but the very essence of his years. The curse was exacting a price that included not only his life, but the future he would never have, aging him into the old man he would never become. Finally, with a last, shuddering rattle, Valmont went still. His head lolled against the high back of the leather chair, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The silence that followed was profound, a heavy blanket that settled over the room. Tituba reached out and picked up the doll from the desk. She wrapped it gently back in the black cloth, her work finished. The 13 dolls, representing 13 lives, had fulfilled their purpose. The debt was paid in full. The judge was dead, and with him, the era of unchallenged dominion over the souls of the Valmont plantation had come to a crashing, irreversible end. The discovery of Judge Valmont's body marked the definitive collapse of the plantation's societal structure, a moment documented in the frantic, scrawled notes of Dr. Thorne before his own departure. He found the judge in the study, his body contorted into a position of ultimate surrender, the skin having taken on the pallor and texture of old parchment. The coroner's report, later filed in the parish courthouse, described the corpse as being aged beyond the judge's years, citing a withering of the tissue that no medical textbook could rationalize. The room itself bore the physical scars of the supernatural struggle, frost patterns etched into the window panes despite the July heat, and the heavy mahogany desk split down the center as if struck by a lightning bolt from below. With the architect of their authority dead, the remaining white population of the Tensas River region fled in a mass exodus that resembled the retreat of a defeated army. The overseers' families, the house staff, and the few remaining creditors packed what they could carry and abandoned the estate, leaving behind the grand architecture of their supremacy. The Valmont mansion, once the proud seat of a 1,400-acre enterprise, stood empty and silent, its doors hanging open to the wind. The peculiar institution relied entirely on the perceived invincibility of the master class. Once that illusion was shattered by the events of the previous 13 days, the reality of power shifted irrevocably to those who remained. Tituba emerged from the big house, not as a victor in the traditional sense, but as a survivor bearing the mantle of spiritual guardian. She carried with her the wooden box containing the 13 effigies, their purpose served but their power dormant, waiting for a final resting place. She walked slowly toward the slave quarters, where the remaining enslaved population had gathered, watching with a mixture of reverence and fear. They did not cheer or riot. They stood in a solemn, hushed assembly, recognizing that a boundary had been crossed, and that the world they had been born into had fundamentally changed. The process of liberation on the Valmont estate was not a chaotic stampede, but a calculated dispersion. Over the next several days, families packed their meager belongings and departed, slipping away into the night or along the riverbanks toward the Union lines rumored to be gathering near Natchez. Tituba, however, refused to leave. She viewed the land not as a prison, but as a consecrated ground where a great battle for justice had been fought and won. Her daughter Delia, now recovered from her fever, stayed by her side, the two women standing as the sole inheritors of the estate's legacy. The burial of the 13 dolls was a ritual of closure that Tituba performed alone, save for the spirits that watched from the tree line. She walked to the edge of the cane fields, to the patch of earth where the gallows had stood, a structure that the fleeing overseers had neglected to dismantle in their panic. Digging a deep hole beneath the shadow of the hanging tree, she lowered the box into the earth. This act was not merely a disposal of evidence, but a sealing of the covenant between the living and the dead, a permanent anchor for the spirits that had served her so faithfully. As she shoveled the dark, fertile soil over the box, she whispered a final prayer to Papa Legba, thanking him for opening the door and asking that it be closed once more. The air grew still as the last of the dirt was patted down, the sounds of the swamp, the chirping of crickets and the croaking of frogs, returning hesitantly to the area. The land had consumed the instruments of death, digesting the hatred and the vengeance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and watchful. It was a silence that commanded respect, a warning to any future interlopers that this ground was no longer neutral territory. In the weeks that followed, the Valmont estate became a subject of whispered legend throughout the Mississippi Delta. The local newspapers, such as the Natchez Courier, made brief mention of the sudden and mysterious dissolution of the Valmont holdings, attributing the mass deaths to pestilential fever to avoid the uncomfortable implication of slave rebellion or supernatural intervention. The official narrative attempted to sanitize the horror, but the oral traditions of the enslaved community carried the truth, embellishing the details into a saga of divine retribution that spread from plantation to plantation. Tituba and Delia took up residence in the overseer's cottage, a modest structure that stood at a safe distance from the oppressive aura of the big house. They tended a small garden and fished in the river, living off the land that had once been worked by the labor of their people. They were technically squatters on abandoned property, but no authority arrived to evict them. The local law enforcement, terrified by the rumors surrounding the estate, treated the property as if it were plague-stricken, avoiding the turn-off to the plantation entirely. The silence of the big house became a character in its own right. Neighbors reported seeing lights moving in the windows of the mansion, despite the building being stripped of furniture and candles. Others claimed to hear the sound of footsteps on the veranda, or the phantom jingling of spurs, the signature sound of the dead overseers wandering the grounds in eternal penance. These spectral reports served as a protective barrier around Tituba, ensuring that she could live out her days in peace, undisturbed by the white world that had tried to break her. By the winter of 1858, the Valmont estate was effectively erased from the map of functioning plantations. The cane fields grew wild, the levees fell into disrepair, and the once immaculate grounds were reclaimed by the encroaching swamp. Nature, in its indifference, proved to be the ultimate beneficiary of the reckoning, covering the scars of human cruelty with a blanket of weeds and new growth. The house stood as a hollow monument, a rotting tooth in the jaw of the landscape, a physical reminder that power built on blood is inherently fragile. The era of the Valmont Dominion had ended not with the Emancipation Proclamation or the Civil War, but with the quiet, lethal determination of a mother's love. The 13 deaths had severed the chain of command, leaving the machinery of slavery to rust in the humid air. Tituba sat on the porch of the cottage, watching the sunset reflect off the white columns of the mansion, knowing that she had carved a hollow space in the history of the region that would never be filled. The debt was paid, the ledger was closed, and the silence that followed was the only tombstone she required. The passage of time transformed the Valmont estate from a scene of recent horror into a landscape of enduring mystery, shrouded by the encroaching wilderness of the Tensa's swamp. For 12 years following the reckoning, Tituba remained the sole human inhabitant of the grounds, living in the overseer's cottage with a quiet resolve that bordered on the monastic. She subsisted on the land, fishing the murky waters and tending a garden that seemed to flourish with an unnatural vigor, as if the earth itself was grateful for the justice it had absorbed. The local newspapers, such as the Natchez Courier, occasionally mentioned the abandoned Valmont property in real estate listings, noting that the fertile acreage was available for a pittance, yet no buyer ever dared to settle there. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 swept over the region like a wildfire, consuming the younger generation of white men in battles that raged from Shiloh to Vicksburg. Yet, the Valmont plantation remained an island of strange tranquility amidst the carnage. Union troops passed by the river landing, and foraging parties from both the blue and the gray occasionally ventured near the property lines, but they invariably retreated. Soldiers' letters housed in the Louisiana State Archives describe the place as having a heavy air, a spiritual pressure that caused horses to balk and men to cross themselves involuntarily. The land had been claimed by a power older than the Confederacy, and it refused to lend its soil to the squabbles of men. Tituba watched the conflict from her porch, a stoic witness to the death throes of the institution that had murdered her son. She provided shelter to escaped slaves making their way toward the Union lines, transforming the cursed plantation into a waypoint on the invisible road to freedom. These travelers, moving under the cover of darkness, spoke of the old woman of the swamp who could bend the spirits to her will. Her reputation as a guardian of the oppressed grew in the telling, elevating her from a former slave to a figure of mythic proportions in the folklore of the Delta. She asked for no payment for her aid, demanding only that the travelers remember the name of her son and the price that had been paid for his dignity. With the conclusion of the war and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, the legal status of the enslaved population changed, but the economic reality of the South remained brutal. Freedmen and women returned to the plantations as sharecroppers, bound to the land by debt rather than chains. However, the Valmont estate remained untouched by this new system of servitude. The land titles were tangled in a web of unpaid debts and heir disputes, but the true barrier to reoccupation was fear. The legend of the 13 deaths had seeped into the very bedrock of the region, acting as a potent deterrent to any speculator or developer who might otherwise have been tempted by the rich alluvial soil. As the 1860s drew to a close, Tituba's health began to decline, her body finally yielding to the accumulation of years and grief. She spent her final days sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, staring toward the spot where the gallows had once stood, now overtaken by a thicket of briars and wild magnolia. Her daughter Delia, now a woman grown and married to a freedman from a neighboring parish, tended to her with gentle devotion. The community had come to view Tituba not merely as an old woman, but as a living monument to a specific, localized history of resistance, a flesh-and-blood reminder that the masters were not gods. The folklore surrounding the plantation had by this time crystallized into a structured legend, a ghost story told to frighten children and warn the cruel. It was said that on humid summer nights, one could still hear the phantom echoes of the hanging, the creak of the rope, and the thud of the trapdoor. But the moral of the story had shifted. It was no longer a tale of tragedy, but one of power. The lesson imparted was that the blood of the innocent cries out to the spirits, and that there exists a justice deeper and more terrible than any statute book. The story of Silas and his mother had become a cornerstone of the region's oral history, a foundational myth for a people navigating the treacherous waters of Reconstruction. In the winter of 1870, Tituba took to her bed, her breathing shallow and her hands resting on the patchwork quilt that covered her. She did not fear the end, for she had walked hand in hand with death for over a decade. She spoke often in her final hours, addressing figures unseen by Delia or the neighbors who sat vigil. She conversed with the Aloha, thanking them for the loan of their power and preparing to return to the realm of the ancestors. The room was filled with the scent of rain and river water, a tangible sign that the spirits were gathering to escort her home. Her death occurred on a cold January morning, the frost crystallizing on the window panes in patterns that resembled the stitches on a voodoo doll. She passed without struggle, her body simply ceasing its labors as if a clock had wound down. Her last words, recorded by her granddaughter, who was present at the bedside, were not a lament, but a statement of completion. "The debt is paid," she whispered, her voice strong for a moment before fading into silence. "I am coming home, my son." With that, Tituba slipped the bonds of the physical world, leaving behind a legacy that would outlast the crumbling bricks of the big house. The funeral was a small private affair, attended by the few remaining souls who knew the true history of the Valmont plantation. She was buried in the slave cemetery, on the edge of the property, her grave marked by a simple wooden cross that would eventually rot away. Yet, the site became a place of pilgrimage for the local African-American community. Visitors would leave offerings of coins, tobacco, and fruit at the unmarked spot, seeking intercession from the saint of the swamps. They understood that while Tituba was gone, the power she had channeled remained embedded in the soil, a dormant volcano of spiritual energy. In the immediate aftermath of her passing, a strange phenomenon was reported by the few brave souls who ventured near the big house. The structure, which had been slowly succumbing to rot and neglect, seemed to sigh, as if releasing a long-held breath. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, replaced by a melancholy quiet that felt less malevolent and more sorrowful. The spirits that had been bound to the place by the curse were not exorcised, but they seemed to settle into a permanent watchfulness. The 13 men had been judged, and the mother had rested. Now, the land belonged to the ghosts, a monument to a justice that the living could not overturn. The story of Tituba and the 13 deaths did not fade with her burial. Rather, it entered a new phase of existence as a defining legend of the Tensas parish. It served as a cultural touchstone, a narrative of empowerment that contradicted the prevailing narratives of white supremacy that resurged during the Jim Crow era. It was a reminder that even in the darkest depths of bondage, there were those who possessed the knowledge and the will to strike back. The Valmont estate became a cautionary tale for the white landowners and a beacon of hope for the disenfranchised, a binary power that kept the land fallow for generations. The transition from history to myth was seamless. Within a generation, the specific dates and names began to blur in the retelling, but the core arithmetic of the vengeance remained precise. 13 lives for one. The story had been stripped of its documentary reality and reclothed in the garments of legend, ensuring its survival in a region where written records of black resistance were often suppressed or destroyed. Tituba was no longer just a woman. She was an archetype, the avenging mother, whose story served as a warning to the wicked and a comfort to the afflicted. The physical ruin of the big house stood for another 20 years, its roof collapsing and its walls crumbling into the encroaching ivy. It was eventually consumed by a brush fire, a final purification that left only the chimneys standing, like accusing fingers against the sky. But the story survived the flames, passed down in hushed tones on porches and in church basements. The legend of the Valmont curse had taken on a life of its own, independent of the physical structures, living in the collective memory of a people who understood that the bonds of love are stronger than the chains of the oppressor. The dissolution of the Valmont estate's physical infrastructure continued unabated into the early years of the 20th century, a process accelerated by the very legend that Tituba had bequeathed to the region. Attempts to auction the land for unpaid taxes were consistently thwarted by the refusal of local officials to set foot on the property, a superstitious dread that persisted despite the march of modernity. The great house, having succumbed to a mysterious blaze in the 1890s, left behind only a series of crumbling brick foundations and the imposing, rot-free columns that seemed to resist decay with a supernatural tenacity. Botanists from Louisiana State University, who surveyed the flora in the 1920s, noted an anomaly in the vegetation. The cane fields had been replaced by a dense, impenetrable thicket of briars and black willow, plants associated in local folklore with protection and mourning, effectively sealing the heart of the plantation from prying eyes. The legend of the 13 deaths cemented itself into the cultural bedrock of Tensas Parish, serving as a dark counter-narrative to the romanticized lost cause mythology that swept the South during the Jim Crow era. While white society publicly dismissed the stories as the ignorant superstitions of the uneducated, their private behavior betrayed a deep-seated fear. Real estate records from the period show that the property lines of the former Valmont plantation were permanently altered, with neighboring landowners ceding ground to the swamp rather than risk disturbing the unmarked graves of the 13 men. The story became a boundary line itself, a psychological border that defined the limits of cruelty in a region where racial violence was often unchecked by law. Sociologists working for the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s documented numerous variations of the Valmont tale, collecting oral histories from the descendants of the enslaved community. These accounts, while differing in minor details, the nature of the specific curses or the names of the minor overseers, remained remarkably consistent in their core arithmetic of justice. The interviewers noted a recurring motif. The interviewees spoke of the plantation not as a place of past horrors, but as a living shrine to the concept of retribution. One subject, a man of nearly 100 years, told the researchers that the wind moving through the willow trees on the old estate still sounded like a mother singing a lullaby, a sound that comforted the oppressed and terrified the guilty. The landscape itself seemed to actively repel attempts at modernization. In 1948, a construction crew attempting to run a rural electrification line through the perimeter of the property reported equipment failures that defied technical explanation. Generators stalled without mechanical cause, and surveying compasses spun erratically, unable to locate magnetic north. The foreman, a pragmatic man from Shreveport, reportedly abandoned thousands of dollars worth of equipment after his men refused to continue work, citing the appearance of strange lights moving through the tree line at dusk. The incident, buried in the electric company's internal memos, served as a modern confirmation of the ancient forces that still held dominion over the land. The tale of Tituba and Silas transcended its status as a local ghost story to become a foundational myth of resistance, offering a spiritual alternative to the philosophy of nonviolence that would later define the civil rights movement. For a people living under the shadow of lynching and segregation, the story provided a psychological sanctuary, a belief system where the powerless had access to a higher court of justice. The narrative suggested that while the bodies of the oppressed could be broken, their spirits retained the capacity to levy a terrifying price upon their tormentors. It was a theology of survival, passed down in hushed tones, that assured the listener that no crime against the innocent went unwitnessed by the ancestors. In the 1970s, a charlatan spiritualist from New Orleans attempted to capitalize on the growing infamy of the site by offering midnight tours of the ruins. These commercial excursions ended abruptly when a group of tourists reported seeing a spectral figure standing near the site of the former gallows. Unlike the terrifying specters of the white overseers, this apparition was described as a woman of regal bearing, her face obscured by a head wrap, radiating an aura of sorrowful power. The resulting panic led to a permanent injunction against trespassing, filed not by a human owner, but by the parish sheriff's office, effectively legalizing the superstition that the land was unfit for the living. The enduring power of the story lies in its mathematical precision, a quality that elevates it above mere folklore into the realm of moral parable. The concept of 13 for 13 resonated deeply within a culture that understood the economics of debt. It transformed the narrative into a spiritual ledger, a grim accounting that validated the worth of a single black child's life against the lives of 13 white men. This numerical symmetry provided a sense of cosmic balance in a world that often seemed fundamentally unbalanced, reinforcing the idea that the universe itself was rigged in favor of justice, however delayed or terrifying in its execution. Modern historians examining the period have noted that the Valmont case represents a rare instance where the systemic power dynamics of the antebellum South were completely subverted within the dominant narrative. While the material reality of slavery was maintained through physical force, the legend asserted the primacy of spiritual force. It serves as a documented case of psychological warfare waged from the bottom up, a successful campaign of terror carried out by the subjugated against their masters. The fact that the story has survived for over a century, growing stronger with each retelling, suggests a cultural necessity for such narratives of agency and vindication. The ecological transformation of the site continues to baffle environmentalists. While the surrounding bayous suffer from invasive species and pollution, the waters immediately bordering the old Valmont landing remain unnaturally clear and teeming with life, a pristine pocket of nature that defies the industrial degradation of the river. Local fishermen refuse to cast nets in these waters, claiming that the fish there are not for the taking, but are guardians of the drowned overseer's grave. This preservation of the natural world around the site stands as a testament to the protective nature of the spirits Tituba invoked, a final seal on the sanctity of her vengeance. The architectural remnants of the big house, specifically the pillars that once supported the veranda, stand today as a form of anti-monument. Unlike the grandiose statues of Confederate generals that dot the South, these crumbling columns do not glorify the past. They warn against it. They serve as a permanent marker of the day, the peculiar institution collided with a power it could not enslave. The site attracts no picnics or family reunions. It is a place of solemn pilgrimage, visited by those who wish to pay respects to a mother who proved that love, when armed with ancient knowledge, is the most formidable weapon against tyranny. The ultimate legacy of the Valmont curse is the preservation of memory in a region that has often sought to bury its uncomfortable truths. While official history books gloss over the brutality of the plantation system, The oral tradition keeps the reality of that violence fresh and visceral. The story acts as a cultural conscience, a reminder that the wealth of the region was built on a foundation of blood, and that the land itself remembers the cost. It denies the descendants of the oppressors the luxury of amnesia, forcing an acknowledgement of the past that is as persistent as the humidity and as deep as the river mud. Today, the Valmont estate remains a void on the map of the parish, a green patch of unintegrated land that serves as a testament to the enduring power of the avenging mother. The story has completed its transformation from a historical event into a timeless legend, a fixture of the southern Gothic landscape that reminds all who hear it that justice is not merely a human construct, but a law of nature. As long as the Spanish moss hangs from the cypress trees and the river winds its way to the sea, the memory of Tituba's vengeance will linger, whispering the undeniable truth that no chain is strong enough to bind the spirit of a mother seeking justice for her child.